The city wakes shrouded in fog as an old police dog senses something dark coming from the abandoned land. Restless, he darts forward, guiding his handler to a child's bow lost in the mud. At the heart of a treacherous swamp, a child slowly sinks, battling silence and time. And when all seemed lost, the instinct of a four-legged hero begins a rescue impossible to forget. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you are watching us from. We continue. Chapter 1. The morning fog still covered the streets of Oak Creek when Joe Martin opened his eyes that Wednesday. The alarm clock hadn't even gone off, but his body was already accustomed to the military routine of 3 decades. Even in retirement, he still woke up before 6, brewed strong coffee, and opened the kitchen window to watch the neighborhood awaken. At 62, with completely white hair and hands marked by scars from old operations, Mr. Joe was respected by everyone in the vicinity. Not for the fear that some police officers inspire, but for the way he treated each person with dignity, as if every resident were part of one large family. Brutus was lying on the living room rug, in the same position as always. The dark-coated Belgian Shepherd was already 10 years old, and each of those years was etched into his tired body. His front paws showed small patches of missing fur, the result of years running in search and capture operations. His muzzle had a few white hairs, and his eyes, though still alert, carried the calm of one who has seen much. But between Joe and Brutus there was something that went far, beyond the relationship between a man and his pet. They were comrades in arms, brothers in uniform, survivors of situations that few could understand. Joe made the coffee and put Brutus's food in his usual bowl. The dog rose slowly, stretched his body with that characteristic movement, and walked to the dish. While he ate, Joe watched through the window. The neighborhood was simple, but it had a life of its own. Modest houses, walls of different heights, some adorned with graffiti art, others merely tagged. There were vacant lots, a legacy of projects abandoned years ago by the city. One of these lots was directly behind his house, separated only by an old wooden fence that he himself had reinforced with extra planks. That lot always bothered him. It was dangerous, filled with dense vegetation, deep puddles, and a treacherous marsh that formed when it rained. He had warned the neighborhood several times about the risks, especially for the children. But Fairview was a city where bureaucracy reigned, and a retiree's warnings rarely reached the right ears. Across the street, just a few yards away, lived the Dawson family. Rachel was 32, a single mother who worked as a cashier at a supermarket downtown. Her routine was demanding. She left home before 7 in the morning and didn't return until after 6 in the evening. Isabel, her 6-year-old daughter, was her reason for living. The girl had dark brown hair always tied in a ponytail, curious eyes and a contagious energy. Every morning Rachel would drop her daughter off at her grandmother's house, Marlene's, who lived 2 houses down. Marlene was a widow, 70 years old, and she cared for Isabel as if she were her own child. The routine was always the same. Rachel would knock on her mother's door, leave the girl, kiss them both on the forehead, and rush off to catch the bus. Marlene would prepare porridge, comb her granddaughter's hair, and walk her to school at 7:30. Then she would pick her up at noon, and they would spend the afternoon together until Rachel returned from work. But that morning something was different. Marlene had a sharp pain in her back, the result of a restless night. When Rachel arrived with Isabel, the grandmother was visibly tired, holding her side with a grimace of discomfort. Rachel grew concerned. "Mum, are you okay?" she asked, helping Marlene sit down in a kitchen chair. "It's just an ache, dear. It's been like this all night. I think it was the way I slept." Rachel glanced at the clock. She was already late. The bus would be there in 5 minutes, and if she missed it, she would be late for work for the 3rd time that month. Her supervisor had already made it clear that one more tardiness would result in a formal warning. She bit her lip, distressed, not knowing what to do. "Mum, I have to go. But you're in a lot of pain. I don't know if you can take Isabel to school today." Marlene forced a smile. "Go on, dear, I'll manage. The girl can stay here with me. I'll take my medicine, lie down for a bit, and then I'll take her." Rachel hesitated. She looked at Isabel, who was playing distractedly with a toy car in the living room. The girl seemed calm, oblivious to her mother's worry. Rachel took a deep breath. "All right, Mom, but if the pain gets worse, you call me, okay? And you don't have to take her to school today. Let her stay with you." "I'll make up for it tomorrow." Marlene nodded, and Rachel left in a hurry. She ran down the street, passed by Joe, who greeted her from his window, and disappeared around the corner. Silence returned to the neighborhood. Inside Marlene's house, the grandmother took a painkiller and lay down on the sofa, covering herself with a light blanket. Isabel continued to play, but the girl was curious and restless by nature. After a few minutes, she started asking if she could play in the backyard. Marlene, already half drowsy from the medicine, murmured yes, but asked her granddaughter not to leave the yard. Isabel promised and went out through the back door. Marlene's backyard was small, enclosed by a low wall that overlooked the vacant lot. Isabel played with a doll, talking to herself, inventing stories. But at a certain point, she heard a sound coming from the lot. It was a meow, a kitten. Isabel loved animals. Her mother had never let her have a pet because the apartment they used to live in was small, and now in the rented house, Rachel was afraid of more expenses. The girl approached the wall. The meow was coming from behind the tall vegetation. She glanced back at the house, saw that her grandmother wasn't watching, and decided to take a quick peek. She climbed onto an old stool that was leaning against the wall, balanced herself, and jumped to the other side. She landed on her feet, straightened her pink dress, and started walking toward the sound. The lot was much larger than it seemed. The vegetation was dense, full of thorny bushes and wet leaves. Isabel walked slowly, calling for the kitten in a soft voice. The meow always seemed to be just ahead, as if the animal were moving. She followed a narrow path, not realizing she was getting farther and farther from the house. The ground began to get softer, muddier. She stepped in a puddle and felt the cold water seep into her sneaker. She grimaced, but continued on. That's when the kitten appeared. It was small, with orange fur, and was perched on a rock looking at her. Isabel smiled and approached slowly, extending her hand. The kitten got scared and leaped from the rock, running into a denser bush. Isabel followed without thinking. She took a few more steps and suddenly felt the ground give way beneath her feet. It was too soft, almost liquid. She tried to step back, but the ground was pulling her down. It was mud, thick, deep mud. She sank to her ankles in seconds. Panic took over. She tried to scream, but her voice came out weak, muffled by the distance and the vegetation. She tried to pull her legs out, but the more she struggled, the deeper she sank. The mud was already at her knees. Isabel began to cry, calling for her grandmother, for her mother, for anyone. But no one could hear her. The vacant lot was large and isolated. Her hands tried to grab onto something, but they only found more mud and slippery leaves. The desperation grew with every second. Meanwhile, on the other side of the neighborhood, Joe Martin was finishing washing the breakfast dishes. Brutus was lying in the living room but began to act strangely. He lifted his head, looked toward the back door, and started sniffing the air. Joe didn't pay much attention. He thought it was just some animal passing near the fence. But Brutus got up and walked to the back window, placing his front paws on the sill and staring intently at the vacant lot. He began to growl softly, a guttural sound Joe knew well. It was the warning growl. "What is it, old boy?" Joe asked, approaching. Brutus began to scratch at the door, restless. Joe opened the back door, and the dog shot out into the yard, stopping at the fence and starting to bark loudly. It wasn't an ordinary bark. It was the work bark, the same one he used on operations when he found something important. Joe frowned and went to the fence. He looked at the vacant lot but saw nothing unusual, just the dense vegetation and the heavy morning silence. "Easy, Brutus, there's nothing there." But the dog wouldn't calm down. On the contrary, he began to bark even louder, trying to jump the fence, howling desperately. Joe knew this behavior. Brutus never acted like this without a reason. During years of partnership, the dog had saved lives, located missing people, and prevented tragedies. Joe felt a shiver run down his spine. Something was wrong. He went back inside, grabbed an old jacket, and opened the back gate. Brutus darted toward the vacant lot as if he knew exactly where to go. Joe followed him, muttering under his breath, stepping carefully between the puddles and wet vegetation. The lot was dangerous, full of hidden holes and unstable areas. He called for Brutus several times, but the dog was already far ahead, disappearing among the bushes. Joe walked for a few minutes, following the sound of the barks. The ground became increasingly muddy, and the smell of rotten earth filled the air. He knew this area. He knew there was a large, deep marsh in the middle of the lot, formed by years of rain and poor drainage. It was a dangerous place, avoided even by adults. But children, he knew, had no sense of danger. That's when Brutus reappeared on the path, coming toward him. The dog had something in his mouth. Joe stopped and waited. When Brutus got close, he dropped the object at his owner's feet. It was a child's hair bow, pink with white polka dots, soaked and covered in mud. Joe picked it up, feeling his heart race. He looked around, confused, and then remembered something. That morning, when he had greeted Rachel, he had noticed she was in more of a hurry than usual, and, the night before, he had overheard Marlene telling a neighbor how mischievous Isabel was, always wanting to explore everything. The thought hit Joe like a punch. Isabel. Was the girl missing? He wasn't sure, but that hair bow couldn't be a coincidence. Brutus started running again, now more focused, guiding Joe down a narrow, almost invisible path between the bushes. The vegetation grew denser, the ground more unstable, until they reached a clearing where the ground looked different. It was darker, undulating, almost alive. The marsh. Joe stopped at the edge, observing carefully. The marsh was wide, at least 30 feet in diameter, and the mud had a thick consistency, almost solid on the surface but treacherous underneath. Pieces of old concrete were scattered around the perimeter, remnants of some abandoned construction project. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of bubbling water and a faint murmur, almost imperceptible, coming from the center of the marsh. Joe paused, listening intently. Brutus barked briefly and fixed his gaze in the direction of the sound. It was then that he heard it, faint, broken, a cry. It was a child's voice, muffled by the mud and the distance. Joe's heart pounded. He moved carefully along the edge, trying to find the source of the sound. In the center of the marsh, almost camouflaged by the mud, was Isabel. Her small body was submerged up to her chest. She was trembling, struggling to keep her chin above the thick mud. Her hands were sunk, trapped by a suction that seemed unwilling to let go. Panic was evident in her wide eyes, but her face showed something even stronger, extreme exhaustion, as if she had been there for hours, waiting for a miracle. "Isabel!" Joe shouted, his voice louder than he intended. The girl turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, a spark of hope shone in that frightened gaze, but she was too weak to respond. She just continued to cry softly, as if she had exhausted all her strength. Joe quickly assessed the situation. The marsh was deep and the suction was strong. If he tried to enter, he would be pulled in too. He needed help, equipment, more people. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, but there was no signal. He cursed under his breath. He looked at Brutus and then made a decision. He had to run back and get help, but leaving the girl there alone even for a few minutes was torture. "Brutus, stay!" he commanded, pointing to the edge of the marsh. The dog obeyed immediately, sitting on the bank, his body tense and his eyes fixed on Isabel. Joe started running back the way he came, his heart pounding, his legs heavy with effort. He went through the fence, crossed his yard, and ran out into the street, shouting for help. Neighbors began to appear at their windows, startled by the commotion. Joe yelled that a child was trapped in the marsh and that he needed help urgently. Gavin, a former firefighter who lived 3 houses down, was the first to react. He ran out of his house, already grabbing a rope he had in his garage. Mr. Arthur, an experienced older man from the area, and Raymond, a strong and willing young man, also joined the group. In less than 3 minutes, they were all running toward the vacant lot, carrying ropes, shovels, and whatever they could improvise in a hurry. Meanwhile, at Marlene's house, the grandmother woke up to the shouts from the street. The back pain had subsided with the medicine, but she was still drowsy. She got up from the sofa and called for Isabel. No answer. She went to the backyard and saw it was empty. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the gate, opened it, and saw the movement on the street. People running, voices shouting about a child in the marsh. Panic seized her. It couldn't be. It couldn't be her granddaughter. Marlene ran toward the crowd, completely forgetting her back pain. She grabbed a neighbor's arm and asked what was happening. The woman, wide-eyed, said that a child was stuck in the marsh in the vacant lot and that Joe was organizing a rescue. Marlene felt her legs go weak. She clung to the neighbor's arm to keep from falling and began to cry, murmuring her granddaughter's name repeatedly. Meanwhile, Joe and the others reached the marsh. Brutus was still in the same position, like a silent guardian, never taking his eyes off Isabel. The girl was still there, but now the mud was reaching her shoulders. Time was running out. Gavin, with his firefighter experience, quickly assessed the situation. He explained that no one could enter the marsh without being sucked in as well. The mud was thick, and the girl was at least 12 feet from solid ground. They would have to use the rope with a loop and try to throw it past the girl, pulling it carefully so it would go under her arms. The initial attempts failed. The rope fell short or too far away. Every second felt like an eternity. The mud was already at Isabel's shoulders, and the heavy silence was broken only by the girl's faint sobs and Brutus's short barks as if he were trying to reassure her with his presence. The tension mounted. Marlene arrived running, stumbling over the vegetation, and upon seeing her granddaughter nearly submerged, she fell to her knees, screaming, unable to get closer. Gavin held her by the shoulders, telling her to stay calm, that they were doing everything they could. Joe looked at Brutus. The dog was lying on the bank, his paws stretched forward, as if trying to reach the girl. It was as if he understood the gravity of the situation and wanted somehow to transmit hope to that child. It was in that moment that Joe felt something shift inside him. He remembered all the times Brutus had saved lives, all the operations where the dog's instinct had been more accurate than any technology. And now, here, even retired, even old, Brutus was still fulfilling his role as a guardian. Raymond took the rope, took a deep breath and made the final throw with all his concentration. The loop flew through the air and landed exactly where it needed to, just beyond Isabel. Gavin pulled carefully, making the rope slide slowly through the mud until it settled under the girl's arms. They all grabbed the rope and began to pull. The mud fought back. The suction was immense. But together, inch by inch, Isabel began to emerge. Brutus barked sharply as the girl's body came free of the mud, soaked, covered in leaves, her eyes closed. Gavin ran and pulled her to the bank with his strong arms. The girl was cold, limp, unresponsive. Cindy, an assistant from a small local clinic who had arrived during the commotion, began first aid. Isabel's body seemed too light. There was mud in her ears, her nose, her mouth. While Marlene cried and Joe watched in silence, Brutus approached and lay down beside the girl. His muzzle lightly touched her face, as if sniffing for the last time, as if entrusting that precious life to the care of the humans. At that moment, no one knew if she would survive. Time seemed to stand still. The sky was darkening with heavy clouds. The mud in the marsh bubbled discreetly, indifferent to the human drama it had witnessed. An ambulance arrived about 10 minutes later, called by someone who had managed to get a signal farther away. The paramedics took over, placed Isabel on a stretcher, connected oxygen and rushed her away. Marlene got into the ambulance with her granddaughter, holding the girl's small, cold hand, praying softly. Rachel was notified at work and left in a rush without even telling her supervisor. She hailed a cab and went straight to the hospital. Brutus remained still until the vehicle disappeared down the dirt road. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. He just watched, with that deep gaze of one who has completed his mission but doesn't yet know if the ending will be happy. Joe knelt beside him and placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the soft ears and the fur matted with mud. "You did your part, old boy. Now it's up to them." Brutus rested his head on Joe's chest, and the two of them stayed there in silence as the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. But nothing would ever be truly normal after that day. The news was already beginning to spread through the streets, on social media, in corner conversations. A little girl had screamed endlessly while trapped in the mud, until a retired police dog did the impossible and found her just in time. Brutus, the silent hero, had saved another life. But the story was far from over. And as the city waited in suspense for news from the hospital, Joe and Brutus returned home, carrying in their hearts the hope that, this time, a miracle had happened. Chapter 2. Fairview Municipal Hospital was bustling that Wednesday afternoon. Crowded hallways, gurneys lining the walls, the characteristic smell of disinfectant mixed with the old, sputtering air conditioning. Rachel arrived in a rush, her hair disheveled and her eyes swollen from crying in the cab. She couldn't stop shaking. Her hands were cold, her heart was racing, her mind endlessly repeating the words her neighbor had said over the phone. Her daughter, her Isabel, trapped in the mud, nearly lifeless. When she walked through the emergency room doors, she found Marlene sitting on a blue plastic bench, her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. The grandmother's clothes were caked with mud, her white hair was a mess and her whole body was trembling uncontrollably. Rachel paused for a second, feeling a violent mix of relief and anger. Relief to see her mother there, which meant Isabel had arrived alive. Anger because deep down she knew something had gone wrong. Marlene was supposed to be watching the girl. She should have noticed she was gone. She should have prevented this from happening. But Rachel swallowed her anger. It wasn't the time. She ran to her mother and knelt in front of her. "Mom, where's Isabel? How is she?" Marlene lifted her face, her eyes red and swollen, and tried to speak, but only sobs came out. She pointed to a set of double doors at the end of the hall, where a sign indicated intensive care unit. Rachel felt the floor drop out from under her. ICU. Her daughter was in the ICU. A nurse approached, wearing a white coat and holding a clipboard. She had a professional expression, but there was compassion in her eyes. "Are you the mother of Isabel Dawson?" Rachel nodded, unable to form words. The girl arrived in critical condition. She had severe hypothermia, mud in her lungs, and signs of asphyxiation. "The doctors are doing everything they can. She's currently intubated and sedated. We need to stabilize her before anything else. You can wait here. As soon as there's an update, we'll call for you." Rachel wanted to scream, to demand to see her daughter, to hold her, to tell her everything was okay, but she knew it would do no good. She just nodded again and sat down next to her mother. The two of them sat there side by side, not speaking, just feeling the weight of the hospital's oppressive silence. Minutes turned into hours. The hallway gradually emptied. Some patients were treated and released, others transferred to beds. Rachel looked at the clock on the wall every 2 minutes, feeling time drag on cruelly. Marlene continued to cry, occasionally murmuring broken phrases. "It was my fault. I fell asleep. I wasn't watching her. God, it was my fault." Rachel wanted to say no, wanted to comfort her mother, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down a part of her also blamed Marlene. A part of her blamed herself for leaving her daughter, for prioritizing her job, for not staying home that day. Guilt is a cruel feeling, one that doesn't choose a single target, but spreads like poison to everyone involved. It was then that the ICU doors opened and a doctor came out. He was young, with thin-rimmed glasses and a tired expression. He looked around, saw Rachel and Marlene, and walked toward them. Rachel stood up so quickly she felt dizzy. "How is she?" The doctor sighed. "Isabel is stable but still in serious condition. We've managed to remove most of the mud from her lungs and we're controlling the hypothermia. She's responding to stimuli, which is a good sign. But the next 24 hours are crucial. Any complication could be fatal. You need to be prepared for any outcome." Rachel felt her legs buckle, but she held on. Any outcome. Those words echoed in her mind like a funeral bell. She took a deep breath and asked if she could see her daughter. "Not just yet. She's sedated and we need to keep her in a controlled environment. As soon as it's possible, I'll let you know. You can stay here at the hospital. We have a more comfortable waiting room on the 2nd floor. I'll ask a nurse to take you there." Rachel thanked him, though she wasn't sure exactly why. The doctor went back into the ICU, and she stood there, staring at the closed door, feeling an overwhelming urge to scream, to punch the wall, to do anything to relieve the pain in her chest, but she did nothing. She just sat back down next to her mother and waited. Meanwhile, in Oak Creek, the news of Isabel's rescue had already spread throughout the neighborhood. People talked on the sidewalks, discussing the incident, praising Joe's courage and Brutus's intelligence. Some neighbors brought food and drinks to Joe's house, thanking him for what he had done. The former police officer, for his part, humbly refused the praise, saying he had only done what anyone would do. But everyone knew that wasn't true. Not just anyone would have the courage to enter that dangerous lot, much less organize such an efficient rescue. Brutus was lying on the living room rug, in the same spot as always, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the door. It was as if he were waiting for something, or someone. Joe watched the dog with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew Brutus better than anyone. He knew the animal was restless, that something was bothering him, and Joe was restless too. He couldn't stop thinking about Isabel, about that pale little face covered in mud, her eyes closed as she was carried away by the ambulance. He picked up his phone and dialed the hospital, but the operator said they couldn't give out information about patients over the phone. Joe grumbled, hung up, and continued pacing the living room. Brutus lifted his head and watched him, as if trying to understand what was happening. Joe knelt beside the dog and stroked his head. "She's going to be okay, old boy. She has to be." Brutus licked Joe's hand, a rare gesture for a trained dog, and rested his head on his paws again. The two of them stayed there in silence as night fell over Fairview. At the hospital, Rachel and Marlene were taken to the waiting room on the second floor. It was a small space, with faux leather sofas, an old television tuned to a news channel, and a malfunctioning coffee machine. There were other people there, families of other patients, each carrying their own burden of anguish. Rachel sat in a corner, hugging her knees, and stared into space. Marlene tried to speak a few times, but Rachel didn't answer. She couldn't. She was lost in her own thoughts, reliving every moment of that terrible day. It was then that a woman entered the room. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with blonde hair tied in a bun and a kind expression. She looked around, saw Rachel and Marlene, and approached them carefully. "Excuse me, are you Isabel's mother?" Rachel looked up and nodded. "My name is Julianne. I live in Oak Creek too, a few streets down from you. I heard what happened and came to see if you needed anything. I brought some snacks, water, and if you need clean clothes, I can go get them." Rachel was surprised. She didn't know this woman, but the kindness of the gesture touched her deeply. She felt her eyes well up with tears again and just murmured a faint, "Thank you." Julianne sat next to her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Isabel is a strong little girl. She's going to get through this. And you're not alone, okay? The whole neighborhood is rooting for her." Rachel nodded and tried to smile, but couldn't. Julianne stayed for a few more minutes, talking softly, trying to offer comfort, until she left, leaving behind a bag with snacks and water. Rachel looked at the bag and felt a wave of gratitude mixed with guilt. Gratitude for the good people that still existed in the world. Guilt for not having been able to protect her daughter. The hours dragged on. The sky outside was now completely dark, and the hospital seemed even quieter. Rachel dozed off from time to time, waking with a start at any noise, thinking it was someone coming with news about Isabel. Marlene also dozed, but she was always mumbling something, as if having nightmares. It was around 11 o'clock at night when the doctor returned. Rachel jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. The doctor looked tired, but there was a faint smile on his face. "Isabel is responding well to the treatment. We've managed to stabilize her completely. Her body temperature is back to normal, and her lungs are clearing up nicely. She's still sedated, but we can now say that the worst is over. She's going to recover." Rachel felt her legs give way, but this time from relief. Marlene let out a cry of joy and began to weep uncontrollably. Rachel hugged her mother, and the two of them stood there crying together, letting all the fear and anguish pour out in tears of relief. The doctor waited, patiently, and when they had calmed down, he continued. "She'll be hospitalized for at least a week for observation. We want to make sure there are no respiratory complications or infections. But the prognosis is good. She was very lucky. If she had been in that marsh for just a few more minutes, we might not have been able to save her." Rachel thought of Brutus, of the dog who had found Isabel, and felt an immense gratitude for that animal. She needed to thank Joe. She needed to do something to repay what he and Brutus had done. But that could wait. Right now, she just wanted to see her daughter. "Can I see her now?" The doctor hesitated. "She's still sedated and intubated. She won't recognize you. But if you want to see her, I can allow a quick 5-minute visit." Rachel nodded desperately. The doctor led her to the ICU. It was a large room with several beds separated by white curtains. The sound of beeping machines and the smell of disinfectant were even stronger here. Rachel followed the doctor to a bed in the corner, and there was Isabel, so small in that bed, with tubes coming out of her mouth and nose, connected to several machines. Her skin was pale, but there was color in her cheeks. She was alive. Alive. Rachel approached and held her daughter's small hand. It was warm. She leaned in and kissed the girl's forehead, murmuring softly, "Mommy's here, my love. You're strong. You're going to be okay. Mommy loves you so much." Isabel didn't respond, but Rachel felt that somehow the girl knew she was there. She held that hand for 5 minutes, until the doctor indicated it was time to leave. Rachel left the ICU with a lighter heart for the first time since that terrible morning. When she returned to the waiting room, Marlene was still crying, but now they were tears of relief. Rachel sat beside her and for the first time spoke to her mother. "She's going to be okay, Mom. Our little girl is going to be okay." Marlene nodded, unable to speak, and they hugged again. The weight of guilt was still there, but now it was lighter, more bearable. Because in the end, what mattered was that Isabel was alive, and she was going to recover. Meanwhile, in Oak Creek, Joe finally managed to sleep, but it was a restless sleep, filled with confusing dreams. Brutus remained on the living room rug, but now he seemed more relaxed, as if he too knew that the worst was over. The night was silent, and the neighborhood slept, but something had changed. A tragedy had been averted, but the scars of that day would remain forever. The next morning, Rachel woke up on the sofa in the hospital waiting room. Marlene was beside her, also asleep. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the hospital was beginning to stir with its morning routine. Rachel stretched, feeling sore from sleeping in an uncomfortable position, and went to the bathroom to wash her face. When she returned, she saw a nurse talking to Marlene. "You can visit Isabel now. She's awake." Rachel's heart leaped. Awake. Her daughter was awake. She ran to the ICU, not even waiting for the nurse. She entered the room and went straight to Isabel's bed. The girl was sitting up, the tube from her mouth already removed, drinking water from a small plastic cup. When she saw her mother, her eyes filled with tears and she held out her arms. "Mommy!" Rachel ran and hugged her daughter, feeling the small, fragile body against hers. She cried uncontrollably, not caring who was watching. Marlene came in shortly after and joined the hug. The three of them stood there, embracing, crying and laughing at the same time, releasing all the pent-up tension. "I was scared, Mommy. I was so scared." "I know, my love, but it's over. You're safe now." Isabel continued to cry, but now they were tears of relief. She told them, in a weak voice, how she had followed a kitten and gotten lost, how she had fallen into the mud and tried to scream for help, how she had seen a big dog and a white-haired man come to save her. Rachel listened to it all, holding her daughter's hand, feeling an immense gratitude for Joe and Brutus. When they left the ICU, Rachel decided she had to do something. She needed to thank them personally. She took out her phone and called a neighbor, asking for Joe's address. The neighbor said that everyone in the neighborhood wanted to pay tribute to him and Brutus, that they were even talking about making a commemorative plaque. Rachel said she wanted to be part of it all, and that as soon as Isabel was discharged, she would go to his house in person. The following days were about recovery. Isabel improved daily, gaining strength, smiling again, becoming the cheerful little girl she had always been. Rachel practically lived at the hospital that week, only leaving to shower and change clothes. Marlene was also there most of the time, and slowly the relationship between mother and daughter began to heal. Rachel realized that blaming her mother wouldn't change anything, and that Marlene was already blaming herself enough. They talked, they cried together, and they forgave each other. In Oak Creek, the story of Brutus spread further and further. Journalists began to seek out Joe, wanting to interview him and the dog. A local TV station did a special report on the rescue, showing footage of the vacant lot and interviewing neighbors. Everyone praised Brutus, the hero dog, and Joe, the former police officer who never stopped serving. Joe, however, remained humble. He turned down most of the interviews, saying he had only done his duty. But deep down he was proud of Brutus, proud to have made a difference, and Brutus, for his part, remained the same calm dog as always, as if he hadn't done anything extraordinary. A week later, Isabel was discharged. Rachel took her home with a mixture of joy and apprehension. The girl was fine, but the trauma of that day was still fresh. Isabel had nightmares, woke up crying and clung to her mother constantly. Rachel knew it would be a long process of emotional recovery, but she was prepared to do whatever it took. On her first day back in the neighborhood, Rachel went to Joe's house. She took Isabel by the hand and the two of them walked slowly down the street until they reached his gate. Rachel rang the doorbell, and Joe appeared at the door. When he saw Isabel, his face lit up with a genuine smile. "Look who's here, little Isabel." The girl looked at him with wide eyes, and then saw Brutus appear behind Joe. Her face transformed. It was the dog who had found her, the dog who had stayed with her while she was trapped in the mud. Isabel let go of her mother's hand and ran to Brutus, hugging the dog's neck with all her might. Brutus, in turn, stood still, letting the girl hug him and then gently licked her face. "It was you who found me, wasn't it?" Isabel murmured, her voice full of emotion. "You're my hero." Rachel felt her eyes well up with tears again. Joe approached, also moved, and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. He's always been a hero, and he always will be. Rachel thanked him profusely, promising that she would never forget what he and Brutus had done. Joe just nodded, speechless, because some things don't need to be said, they are simply felt. And there, on that sunny afternoon in Oak Creek, 3 lives intertwined in a way that could never be undone. Isabel, Joe, and Brutus. A girl who was saved, a man who never stopped protecting, and a dog who, even in retirement, continued to fulfill his role as a silent guardian. The story was far from over. There was still much to be revealed, many emotions to be explored, and a bond that was just beginning to form. And as the sun set over Fairview, that small, simple, and peaceful neighborhood knew that it had witnessed something special, a miracle, a second chance, and an unconditional love that transcended words. Chapter 3. The weeks that followed Isabel's rescue brought profound changes for everyone involved. Oak Creek, once just another quiet neighborhood in Fairview, now held a story that people told with pride. The news of the rescue had spread throughout the city and even to other regions. Newspapers published articles, radio programs dedicated special segments, and social media exploded with messages of admiration for Brutus and Joe. But for Joe, life remained simple. He still woke up early, made strong coffee, fed Brutus, and spent his mornings reading the newspaper or fixing things around the house. The only difference was that now, whenever he went for a walk, people would stop to greet him, to thank him, to ask for photos with Brutus. The dog, for his part, remained the same silent guardian as always, walking beside his owner with the dignified posture of one who has served his entire life. Isabel, however, couldn't stay away from Brutus. Every afternoon after school, she would ask her mother to take her to Joe's house. Rachel always agreed, because she saw in her daughter's eyes a special connection with that dog. It was as if Brutus represented safety, protection, unconditional love, and Joe, in turn, welcomed the girl with paternal affection. He had never had children, never had a family of his own. His life had always been dedicated to his work, to the police force, to risky operations that left no time for lasting relationships. But now at 62, he was discovering the joy of having a child around, of hearing laughter echo through his house, of seeing Brutus interact so gently with Isabel. A month after the rescue, the city of Fairview organized an official recognition ceremony. It was to be held in the town square on a Saturday morning, with the mayor, the press, and the community in attendance. Joe tried to decline, saying he didn't deserve all the attention, but the public pressure was so great that he eventually accepted. Rachel and Isabel would be there, as would Marlene, Gavin, Mr. Arthur, Raymond, and practically every resident of Oak Creek. On the morning of the event, Joe put on his old police uniform. It had been stored in his closet for years, carefully folded, with the medals still pinned to the chest. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a different man from the one who had retired 10 years earlier. His hair was completely white, his face more wrinkled, but his eyes still held that glint of determination. Brutus, beside him, also seemed to understand the importance of the day. He was alert, his ears pricked up and his body erect. The square was packed when they arrived. Hundreds of people were applauding, shouting Brutus's name, holding signs with messages of thanks. There were children, adults, seniors, all there to celebrate a four-legged hero and his human partner. The mayor took to the makeshift stage and delivered an emotional speech about courage, about serving the community, about never giving up on protecting others. Then he called Joe and Brutus to the stage. The crowd erupted in applause. Joe climbed the steps with Brutus at his side, and when he reached the stage, he felt an emotion he hadn't expected. He looked out at the crowd and saw Rachel, Isabel, and Marlene in the front row. Isabel was holding a handmade sign that read, "Thank you, Brutus, my hero," adorned with drawings of hearts and stars. Joe felt his eyes well up, but he held back the tears. The mayor presented Joe with a Medal of Merit and a special gold-plated collar for Brutus. Then he invited Isabel to come up on stage. The girl, shy but determined, climbed the steps and walked over to Brutus. She knelt in front of the dog and hugged him tightly, murmuring a soft thank you that everyone felt in their hearts. Brutus licked her face, and the crowd exploded in applause and cheers of joy. It was a moment of pure emotion, captured by dozens of cameras, that would become a symbol of hope for the entire city. After the ceremony, there was a community luncheon in the square. Tables were set up, food was brought by residents, and everyone celebrated together. Joe talked with people he hadn't seen in years, reminisced about old times, and shared stories from his days on the force. Brutus was surrounded by children, all wanting to pet him, or wanting to take pictures, and he, patient as always, allowed it, as if he understood that this was his role. Late in the afternoon, as the square began to empty, Rachel approached Joe. There was something in her eyes he couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, of course, but also something deeper. She asked if she could speak with him in private. Joe nodded, and the two of them moved a little away from the crowd while Isabel continued to play with Brutus. "Mr. Joe, I wanted to thank you again for everything. Not just for saving Isabel, but for opening your home to us, for letting my daughter spend so much time with you and Brutus. I know you don't have to do any of that." Joe shook his head. "It's not an obligation, Rachel. It's a pleasure. I never had children, never had a family. Having Isabel in the house, hearing her laugh, watching her play with Brutus, it's brought a joy I didn't know I could still feel." Rachel smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. "You know, I raised Isabel on my own. Her father left us when she was a baby. I've never had help from anyone. It's always been just me and my mum. And now to see that there's someone like you who truly cares, who is there for her without expecting anything in return, it means so much to me." Joe felt a tightness in his chest. He placed a hand on her shoulder in a fatherly way. "You're an amazing mother, Rachel. Isabel is lucky to have you, and I'm lucky to have both of you in my life now." The two stood in silence for a few seconds, just watching Isabel play with Brutus. It was a moment of quiet connection, of mutual understanding. Rachel was only 32, but she had already lived so much. She worked hard, raised her daughter alone, and dealt with financial struggles without complaint. And Joe, at 62, felt he had found something that had always been missing in his life. A family, not of blood but of choice, of the heart. Weeks turned into months. Isabel continued to visit Joe and Brutus almost every day. She would do her homework at the kitchen table, while Joe made coffee and told stories of his operations. Brutus would lie at the girl's feet, a silent, ever-watchful guardian. The bond between the three of them grew stronger each day, and Rachel, who had initially worried about being a bother, began to realize that this was just as important for Joe as it was for her daughter. But there was something Rachel started to notice. Brutus was slower. Sometimes when he got up, his hind legs would tremble. He was still alert and affectionate, but he no longer had the energy he once did. Joe noticed it too, but he didn't say anything. He knew Brutus was getting old, that time was taking its toll, but he preferred not to think about it. He preferred to enjoy every moment he still had with his companion. It was on a hot, muggy October afternoon, typical for Fairview, that things began to change. Isabel was at Joe's house, playing in the backyard with Brutus. The dog was lying in the shade of a tree, and the girl was beside him, telling an invented story about a princess and a magical dog. Suddenly, Brutus tried to get up, but his hind legs failed him. He fell to his side with a low whimper. Isabel screamed, frightened. "Mr. Joe! Mr. Joe! Brutus fell!" Joe ran out of the house and found Brutus lying on the ground, breathing with difficulty. His heart pounded. He knelt beside the dog, stroked his head, and called his name several times. Brutus opened his eyes, tried to get up again, but couldn't. Joe grabbed his phone and called the emergency vet, explaining the situation. The vet told him to bring him in immediately. With a neighbor's help, Joe managed to get Brutus into the back seat of a borrowed car. Isabel was crying, begging to go with them, but Joe told her it was better for her to stay and that he would call later with an update. The girl was reluctant, but obeyed. Rachel was notified and rushed over to pick up her daughter, finding her in tears at Joe's gate. "What happened, my love?" "Brutus fell. He couldn't get up." "What if he dies, Mommy?" Rachel hugged her daughter, not knowing what to say. She was worried too. Brutus was more than a dog. He was a symbol of hope, of protection, of love. And for Isabel, he was the hero who had saved her life. At the vet's office, Joe waited anxiously while the doctors examined Brutus. After nearly an hour, the vet came out with a serious expression. He explained that Brutus had a degenerative disease in his hind legs, common in older dogs of his breed. There was no cure, only palliative treatment to reduce the pain and improve his quality of life for the time he had left. The vet was direct and honest. Brutus had at most a few months to live, maybe even less. Joe felt the floor drop out from under him. Brutus, his companion of so many years, his brother, his hero. It was coming to an end. He tried to maintain his composure, thanked the vet and took Brutus back home. The dog was sedated, calm, but Joe knew nothing would be the same. When he got home, it was dark. Joe laid Brutus on the living room rug, covered him with a blanket, and sat beside him. He stayed there in silence, just stroking the dog's head, remembering all the operations they had done together, all the lives they had saved, all the moments they had shared. The tears finally came, and Joe didn't hold them back. He cried, as he hadn't cried in decades. He cried for the impending loss, for the injustice of time, for the anticipatory grief. Brutus opened his eyes and looked at Joe. There was understanding in that gaze, as if he knew, as if he were saying it was okay, that he had fulfilled his mission, that he was ready. But Joe wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. The next day, Rachel and Isabel came to visit. When Isabel saw Brutus lying on the rug, unable to get up, she ran to him and lay down beside him, hugging the dog's large body. Brutus gently licked her face and the girl cried softly. Rachel spoke with Joe in the kitchen, and he told her everything the vet had said. Rachel felt a deep sadness, not just for Brutus, but for Joe. She knew how much that dog meant to him. In the following weeks, the routine changed. Brutus spent most of his time lying down, struggling to move. Joe gave him the prescribed medication, prepared special food, and did everything in his power to ensure Brutus wasn't in pain. Isabel continued to visit, always lying beside the dog, telling stories, singing songs. It was as if she wanted to repay all the love Brutus had given her. The news of Brutus's condition spread through the neighborhood. People started visiting, bringing gifts, cards, and messages of affection. A silent vigil was organized at Joe's house, where residents took turns keeping the dog and his owner company. It was incredible to see how an entire community rallied around an animal. But Brutus wasn't just an animal. He was a symbol, a reminder that kindness, courage, and unconditional love still existed in the world. One afternoon, as Isabel lay beside Brutus, she asked softly, "Mr. Joe, is Brutus going to heaven when he leaves?" Joe, who was sitting in the chair next to them, felt his eyes fill with tears. He took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, he is. And there he'll be young again, able to run and play without any pain. And from up there he'll keep watching over you." Isabel smiled, though she was also crying. "So he'll always be protecting me, right?" "Always, my dear. Always." And in that moment, Joe realized something. He realized that Brutus had fulfilled his mission, not just by saving Isabel from that marsh, but by uniting a community, by bringing hope, by showing that true love knows no bounds. Brutus had left a legacy that would last forever. The days continued to pass. Brutus grew weaker, but he never lost that attentive gaze, that comforting presence. And every night Joe would lie on the floor beside him, stroke his head, and murmur softly, "Thank you, old boy, thank you for everything. You were the best partner anyone could have ever had." And Brutus, in silence, continued to be the guardian he had always been. Not just of a little girl, but of an entire community. Of a family he had helped create, of a love that transcended words, time, and even life itself. The story was reaching its most delicate moment, a moment of farewell, of gratitude, of transformation. And as the sun set over Fairview, everyone knew that something special was about to happen. Something that would forever change the lives of these people, something that would prove that some bonds are never broken, even when life asks us to say goodbye. Chapter 4. Dawn broke grey that Tuesday in November. A cold breeze wafted through the windows of Joe Martin's house, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and jasmine from the neighbor's garden. Joe had been awake since 4 in the morning, sitting on the floor beside Brutus, watching the dog's slow, labored breathing. There was something different in the air that morning, a sense of imminent farewell that he knew well from his years of service. It was the same weight he felt before dangerous operations, when he knew not everyone would come back. But this time was different. This was personal. This was Brutus. The dog slowly opened his eyes and met Joe's gaze. There was a profound calm in those brown eyes, an acceptance that only animals seem to possess. Brutus tried to move his head to lick Joe's hand, but even that simple gesture seemed to require immense effort. Joe gently stroked his companion's head, feeling the soft ears between his fingers, memorizing every detail of that moment. "You're tired, Aunt." "You, old boy?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been a long battle, but you were strong to the end. You always were." Brutus closed his eyes again, but his breathing continued. Joe knew this would be the day. He felt it in his heart, in his soul, in that inexplicable place where intuition resides. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Rachel. Just 3 words. "It's today. Come." Rachel received the message while making breakfast for Isabel. Her heart tightened. She had dreaded this day, but she knew it was inevitable. She called her daughter, who was getting ready for school, and carefully explained that Brutus was very weak and that this might be their last chance to say goodbye. Isabel, now 7, was more mature than she should have been. She had learned about loss, about courage, about love over the past few months. She nodded silently, grabbed the backpack where she kept a special drawing she had made for Brutus, and the two of them left the house. When they arrived at Joe's, they found other people already there. Gavin was in the living room, standing with his hands in his pockets, his eyes red. Mr. Arthur was sitting on the sofa, his head bowed. Raymond was leaning against the wall, repeatedly cleaning his glasses, clearly trying to control his emotions. Marlene was in the kitchen making coffee, though her hands trembled so much that she spilled half of it. The news had spread quickly that morning, and the entire neighborhood seemed to be holding a silent vigil. Isabel entered the living room slowly and saw Brutus lying on the rug, covered with Joe's favorite blanket. The dog's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. The girl approached, knelt beside him, and gently placed her hand on his chest. She felt his heart beating slowly, but still beating. Brutus opened his eyes and looked at her. There was recognition there. There was love. "Hi, Brutus. I brought you a drawing," she whispered, taking the folded paper from her backpack. "It's us, see? You, me, and Mr. Joe. We're in the garden playing. And there's a big sun because you were always my sun, you know. You always lit up my life." The girl held the drawing in front of Brutus's muzzle, and the dog's eyes shifted slightly as if trying to see. Isabel placed the paper beside him and then lay down on the floor, hugging the dog's large body, resting her face against his soft fur. She began to sing softly a song that Joe used to hum, an old tune about friendship and loyalty. Her voice was sweet and shaky, but there was a strength in it that moved everyone in the room. Rachel watched from the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face. She looked at Joe and saw that he was crying too, without trying to hide it. She approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. The two stood there in silence, witnessing that sacred moment of farewell between a girl and the dog who had saved her life. The hours passed slowly. More people from the neighborhood came to pay their respects. They brought flowers, cards, words of comfort. The house was full, but there was a silent respect for the moment. No one spoke loudly, no one made noise. It was as if everyone understood they were witnessing something greater than themselves. They were witnessing the end of an era, but also the beginning of a legacy that would never be forgotten. Around noon, the vet arrived. Joe had called him that morning, asking him to make a house call. The doctor examined Brutus carefully and then spoke with Joe privately in the kitchen. "He's suffering, Joe. His body is failing. There's nothing more we can do besides make sure he's not in pain. You know what needs to be done." Joe knew. He had always known this day would come, but knowing didn't make it any easier. He took a deep breath, wiped his tears, and nodded. He asked for just a few more hours, so everyone could say a proper goodbye. The vet agreed and left, promising to return late in the afternoon. Joe went back to the living room and sat beside Brutus. Isabel was still lying with him, but now she was just holding his front paw, stroking it slowly. Joe placed his hand on Brutus's head and began to speak. He didn't care that other people were listening. These words were for his companion. "Brutus, you were the best partner anyone could have ever had. So many years together, so many operations, so many lives saved. You never hesitated, never backed down, never gave up, and even now, old and tired, you still managed one last mission. You saved Isabel, you saved a family, you saved an entire community from losing hope. You showed all of us what it means to be a true hero, and I'm going to miss you every single day of my life. But I'll try to be strong just like you always were. I'll take care of Isabel and Rachel. I'll honor your memory by being the kind of person you always inspired me to be." Joe's voice broke at the end, and he bowed his head, resting his forehead on Brutus's neck. The dog, with immense effort, lifted his head slightly and licked Joe's face one last time. It was a gesture of farewell, of gratitude, of love, and everyone in the room felt the weight of that moment. Gavin approached and knelt on the other side of Brutus. He placed his hand on the dog's chest and said, "Thank you for showing us what courage means, my friend. You saved that little girl, but you also saved all of us from forgetting what really matters in life." One by one, everyone in the room came forward to say goodbye. Mr. Arthur, Raymond, Marlene, the neighbors who were there, each shared a word, a memory, a thank you. And Brutus, though weak, seemed to hear it all. He seemed to understand that he was loved, that his life had meaning, that his legacy would continue. As the sun began to set, the vet returned. The house was emptier now. Only Joe, Rachel, Isabel, and a few close neighbors remained. The doctor prepared everything with care and respect. He explained that it would be quick, that Brutus wouldn't feel any pain, that he would simply fall asleep peacefully. Joe held Brutus's head in his lap. Isabel was beside him, holding the dog's paw. Rachel stood behind them, her hands on her daughter's shoulders. The vet administered the first injection, a mild sedative. Brutus closed his eyes, relaxing completely. His breathing became even slower, calmer. Then came the second injection, and in less than a minute Brutus's heart stopped beating. The silence that followed was absolute. There were no words to describe that moment. It was a mixture of profound sadness and immense gratitude. Sadness for the loss, but gratitude for having had the honor of knowing such a special being. Isabel cried softly, but didn't let go of Brutus's paw. Joe continued to hold the dog's head, stroking his ears, repeatedly murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." The vet waited a few minutes before asking what Joe wanted to do. He had already decided. He wanted Brutus to be cremated, and for the ashes to stay with him. He wanted to keep his companion close forever. In the days that followed, grief settled over Oak Creek. But it was a different kind of grief. It wasn't just sadness. It was also a celebration of a life well lived, of unconditional love, of a legacy that would never be forgotten. The city of Fairview approved a proposal to build a statue of Brutus in the town square, immortalizing the hero dog. A plaque would be placed in the vacant lot where Isabel had been rescued, telling the story and warning of the area's dangers. And the community mobilized to raise funds for an animal adoption center that would bear Brutus's name. Joe spent the first few days in a deep silence. The house felt empty without Brutus's presence. Without the sound of his paws on the floor, his watchful gaze, his quiet companionship, but slowly, with the help of Rachel and Isabel, he began to process the loss. He started to talk about Brutus with a smile, recalling funny stories, successful operations, moments of affection. And he realized that although Brutus was no longer physically present, his spirit was still there. In every memory, in every story, in every life he had touched. Isabel, for her part, changed after Brutus's passing. She became more introspective, more thoughtful, but she also became stronger. She began visiting Joe every day, not because he had a dog, but because he had become part of her family. She helped him. In the garden, did her homework at his kitchen table, listened to his stories. And slowly Joe realized he wasn't alone. He had gained a family, a daughter, even if not by blood, and a granddaughter of the heart. Rachel also grew closer to Joe. She began visiting him not just with Isabel but on her own as well. They talked about life, about challenges, about dreams. And Joe discovered that, at 62, there was still room in his heart for new connections, new affections. It wasn't romance, but it was something equally valuable. It was deep friendship, chosen family, unconditional love. 3 months after Brutus's passing, the statue was unveiled in Fairview's town square. It was beautiful, cast in bronze, showing Brutus in an alert stance, his gaze fixed forward like an eternal guardian. At the base of the statue, a plaque read, "In memory of Brutus, the hero dog who taught us the true meaning of courage, loyalty, and unconditional love. May his legacy inspire future generations." The unveiling ceremony was even larger than the previous one. There were hundreds of people, TV cameras, officials, but also ordinary citizens who wanted to pay their respects. Joe was there, with Isabel and Rachel by his side. When the statue was revealed, the crowd erupted in applause. Many wept. Joe looked at that representation of his companion and felt a mixture of pride and longing. But he also felt peace, because he knew Brutus would never be forgotten. Isabel let go of her mother's hand and walked to the statue. She placed her hand on Brutus's bronze paw and closed her eyes, as if saying a silent prayer. When she returned, she had a smile on her face. "I felt him, Mommy. I felt Brutus. He's here watching over all of us." Rachel hugged her daughter, also with tears in her eyes, and nodded, because she believed it too. She believed that some spirits are so strong, so pure, that they never truly leave. They just change form. They become memory, legacy, inspiration. Months turned into years. Life in Oak Creek went on, but something had changed forever. The people were more united, more supportive, more attentive to one another. The vacant lot was finally cleared by the city and turned into a community park with safe play areas for children. The plaque honoring Brutus was there, and every day, parents brought their children to learn the story of the hero dog. Joe remained a respected figure in the neighborhood. He became a volunteer at the animal adoption center named after Brutus, helping to train rescued dogs, sharing his knowledge, spreading love. And every night before going to sleep, he would look at the urn holding Brutus's ashes on the living room shelf and murmur softly, "Good night, old boy. See you tomorrow." Isabel grew up strong and determined. At 12, she was already talking about becoming a veterinarian, about caring for animals like Brutus, about making a difference in the world. She never forgot the dog who saved her life, and she carried within her the most important lesson he had taught, that true love is given without expecting anything in return, that it protects without fear, that it endures even when all seems lost. Rachel, for her part, found in Joe not just a friend but the father figure she had always lacked. He helped her through difficult times, advised her when she needed it, and was present for the important moments in Isabel's life. And together, the three of them formed an unlikely but genuine family. A family united not by blood, but by experience, by gratitude, by love. And Brutus, though no longer physically present, remained the bond that united them all. His story was told and retold in schools, at community gatherings, in family conversations. He became a symbol of hope for an entire city, living proof that heroes still exist, that goodness still exists, that pure and true love still exists in the world. One Sunday morning, 5 years after Isabel's rescue, Joe was sitting on a park bench watching children play around Brutus's statue. Isabel was there, now 12 years old, explaining the hero, dog story to younger children. Rachel was beside him, sipping coffee from a paper cup, smiling as she watched her daughter's enthusiasm. "You know Isabel wants to be a vet because of him, right?" Rachel said, looking at Joe. "I know, and she'll be a great one. Brutus would be proud." "He already is proud. Wherever he is, he's seeing all of this, seeing what he created." Joe smiled. It was true. Brutus had created something bigger than himself. He had created a community, a family, a legacy of love. And as long as that statue stood there, as long as that story was told, Brutus would live on. Not just in the memories of those who knew him, but in the hearts of all who were touched by his story. The sun shone brightly that morning, and a gentle breeze made the leaves on the trees dance. Joe closed his eyes for a moment and felt a sense of deep peace. He felt that he had fulfilled his mission, that he had honored his companion's memory, that he had made a difference. And somewhere, beyond the blue sky and white clouds, perhaps Brutus was running free, young and strong, again with that attentive gaze and that immense heart, continuing to watch over all those he loved. Because some bonds are never broken, some loves never die, and some guardians never stop protecting, even when they are no longer here. The story of Brutus, the hero dog, would live on forever, not just in statues or plaques, but in the hearts of all who believe that true love can change the world. One bark at a time, one life saved at a time, one heart touched at a time. And as the sun set over Fairview, illuminating the bronze statue, in the town square a final breeze blew, making the leaves dance around it, as if it were a last goodbye, or perhaps a see you later, because heroes never really die. They just become legends, inspiration, eternal love.